Mrs. Barnes made small talk on the way to the working museum. The weather was overcast, but that didn't bother me. I was out of the house and enjoying the drive. I thought about when Mrs. Barnes referred to me as she before we left. Being referred to as he didn't seem right, and being called a she at least matched my appearance. I also thought about Mother saying a proper young lady. She sounded almost proud of me. I anticipated being called Rebecca all day long. This is going to be weird, I thought, but not as weird as it would be being called Peter all day. Here we are, Rebecca, said Mrs. Barnes after about half an hour. She turned into the drive which led to a sizable stately home. Wow, I said as we approached it. That's huge. It certainly is, Mrs. Barnes replied. And it's largely residential too. She added. You mean people still live here? Yes. Only a small portion is set aside as the working museum. Blimey. Imagine hoovering all that. Mrs. Barnes chuckled as she pulled into a vacant parking space. The entrance led into a sizable courtyard which had a working smithy and kitchen garden. We watched a demonstration of a horseshoe being made, followed by a huge Shire horse being shod. I took several photos with Mother's camera, and Mrs. Barnes took several photos of me stood by a variety of old carts and other exhibits. Next was the Victorian kitchen. A group of visitors listened as the tour guide, who was in full Victorian dress, explained the workings of a Victorian kitchen and how it differed greatly from modern kitchens. She also explained how the hierarchy of the maids worked, from the housekeeper at the top, the lady's maid, the cook, the parlour maid down to the kitchen maid and scullery maids. As she talked, a lady in traditional Victorian dress worked the kitchen. Now, as you can see, said the tour guide, the cook is working very hard and could do with some help, so I need 3 girls to volunteer and get first-hand experience of life in a Victorian kitchen. She looked expectantly at the visitors and picked out 2 girls from the school group. Now we need 1 more girl, a little older maybe? She looked directly at me as she spoke. I froze. Well, go on, Rebecca, encouraged Mrs. Barnes. Give me your handbag and I'll take some photos. Nervously I stood alongside 2 other girls who had been chosen to get first-hand experience of life in a Victorian kitchen. Mrs. Barnes smiled at me reassuringly as I glanced across the faces of the other visitors. Well, now we have our brave volunteers, smiled the tour guide, but can anybody tell me what's wrong with them? She said directly to the younger children in the school group. Anybody? She prompted. One little girl put her hand up and said, their clothes. Well done, said the tour guide, their clothes are far too modern to work in a Victorian kitchen, so I'll take our 3 volunteers to get changed into something more appropriate whilst the cook tells you all about the kitchen. Some of the children giggled as their 2 friends and me were herded into another room. I felt the look of horror sweep across my face. Mrs. Barnes smiled an encouraging smile.